We all are seated. So welcome to this panel discussion on To Err is Human. And I'm always fascinated by the origin of ideas and words and the meaning that we ascribe to it. And if you think about To Err is Human, anyone know where that actually comes from? And there's a few people who are banned from answering that. That would be one, Daniel, because we did some research on this. But anyone know where this phrase, to err is human, comes from? And by the way, Kelvin's got a great prize sorted. Is that right, Kelvin? He'll find something in the bottom of the prize drawer. But anyone want to sort of offer where they think this sort of saying, because it's one of those sayings that we use, to err is human? Anyone? Sorry? You're very close. You've actually ended what is used in Alexander Pope's poem in 1711 called An Essay on Criticism. And he actually borrows from a Roman philosopher, a person by the name of Seneca. And he had a very interesting saying, and I'm not going to attempt the Latin. That's not my native language. But Alexander Pope said, to err is human, and to forgive is divine. And I thought,
this is total rubbish. This is absolute rubbish. I just want to say that I didn't prepare for to err is human.
Yeah.
They told me this was the philosopher Homer Simpson, and I've prepared for to der is human.
Well, now,
this is preposterous.
I just want to point out that what actually happened with this, like all good panel discussions, you know how sometimes a panel discussion has the holy huddle about 5 minutes beforehand. What are we going to talk about? Well, you see, these guys actually got a briefing paper. And that briefing paper,
read it, though.
And some people, like Sydney, probably didn't read the briefing paper. But they have a briefing paper. So what's interesting, it sort of comes from Homer Simpson. Some people obviously are well studied in terms of the origin of ideas. But also it's interesting, Seneca said, to err is human, but to persist in error, and then he puts in brackets, because I suppose in Latin you can have brackets, out of pride, is diabolical. So what I thought would be good is to get the conversation going here in the house. I thought I might just get you to introduce yourselves briefly. And when I say briefly, this rule here applies. And if they go over 1 minute, you know what you do? What do you do? If they go over 1 minute?
Cut off the mic.
Now come on, safety differently. We're searching for the positives, aren't we? What are we going to do if they go longer than a minute? Fantastic. We'll applaud them till they stop. Okay. So that's what we're going to do. Now, what we're going to do here, I've asked them to introduce themselves briefly, and I've asked them to tell us what fascinates them about this notion that, basically in being human, we sort of make mistakes. So, we're going to start with you, Sydney, and then we'll move down the line.
That's a mistake.
I realised that. I wanted to practice this with you, Sydney. Okay, so we're going to go this way.
Are we counting our minute, or can I finish this? Okay.
You can start.
My name is Sidney Ducker. I'm a migrant worker.
457.
What was the question? No,
Really,
actually,
getting the rain, did you not pay attention to the briefing, Sydney?
To you? No.
And to me. To err is definitely a mistake, Sydney. But no, seriously, I want to know from you what.
My student will answer it.
I still want to know what fascinates you about this, because you're one of the people on the panel that has, in terms of your career, spent a long time reflecting on this. So what is it that actually fascinates you about it?
It's false.
It's false. Okay, well, we'll get to there, and thank you. You just bought yourself a bit more time. Let's move on down.
Mike Latomsky, formerly of NASA, and we actually, in my former job, we actually tried to quantify the human error, and there's countless ways to do that, but
And make errors doing it.
And make errors doing it. And the funny thing is, we had a conference, international conference, where we got people from 12 different countries and to present their favorite way to quantify human error. And after 5 days, they came out with the result was supposed to be to come up with a top 2 or 3 that would be recommended to be used at NASA. And after like a week, they came out with 12 different ways to quantify human error. So actually, nobody would let go of their favorite. So they agreed just to disagree that everyone had the best way individually. So anyways, it's sort of a fool's errand, but we try to quantify the human error, and there's a million techniques, so we just fumble through and do the best.
So you just
we
took a
can.
democratic approach and said you're all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was pretty funny because...
Yeah, it's interesting. So from a technical perspective, this has fascinated you in your career, Michael. I've read a little bit about you and NASA. So you bring a bunch of experts together, put them in a room for 5 days. We're going to simplify this, we make it more complex.
That's right, yeah.
Fantastic, excellent. We'll move on down. We'll move to Homer Simpson.
Yeah, there's only one answer, isn't there? Duh. So, I'm Geoffrey Braithwaite. I'm Professor of Health Systems Research at Macquarie University. And what I'm very interested in is how come so many disparate people, so many different stakeholders can take a different perspective on something that seems like it's a concrete construct, that it's something that we can understand. So in my journey, I've made a journey into greater and greater complexity. So I've found that I know more and more about less and less.
It's fascinating.
To the point in time when I know bugger all about anything.
Yeah.
But don't tell my Vice-Chancellor, okay?
Fascinating. So as you move into complexity, what appears to be bleedingly obvious becomes least so.
Your teenage children already know this, though.
They've already discovered this. Well,
About you, yeah.
They've actually decided that you are fundamentally a mistake, as I have 2 of them. But let's move on down in introductions.
So I'm Michael Toomer. I'm a partner at Northern Rose Fulbright. I'm firstly fascinated that you would invite a lawyer to speak on this topic. But I'm more fascinated that the topic of human error fascinates the safety profession so much and has fascinated it so much for so long. And the reality is that we have grappled with that debate for a long time. We've even, I dare say, put laws in place to try and force people to grapple with the reality that humans make mistakes. And yet, here we are at a fantastic conference debating it, and with a panel of esteemed experts talking about it.
So hopefully we'll come up with at least another 14 or 15 sort of understandings, and then we can regulate, and we'll all go home and feel good about it.
My name is Rosa Carrillo. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I have a practice in leadership development and that specializes in safety. The thing that fascinates me is that I think the reason we are so uncomfortable with human error is because we're uncomfortable with our own errors and the possibility of making mistakes and losing face. The moment that we're able to accept the fact that we can and will make mistakes and we forgive ourselves and we accept it, other people respond to us and open up to us and are willing to tell us about their mistakes. And so while we spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how we're going to get people to talk about things like drift and near misses and stop each other from doing unsafe acts, we have to start first within ourselves as leaders, each of us, every one of us in this room.
Excellent. So you really want to take us to the core of humanity and say fundamentally we just don't like looking in the mirror. So we externalise it and we talk a lot about other people's mistakes, but we won't actually look in our own backyard. Okay, interesting proposition. The last word in terms of introductions, but not the last word in terms of debate.
Down the line, I'm at the end of the line that started here and went that way. So David Provan, I'm the General Manager of HSC, and yes, I am one of Sydney's students. I'm fortunate to be one of Sydney's students. Look, human error doesn't really fascinate me, and I don't think it's overly useful for helping with safety at work. What does fascinate me is how people make decisions. And there's a lot of judgments about whether decisions are good or bad and whether decisions are in error or not in error. And I think the more we understand about how we as people understand the world around us and make decisions and judgments and then give effect to actions and behaviours which create outcomes, the better place we'll be to understand as safety practitioners how we need to help people to make decisions that create better outcomes for themselves.
He has just passed his pre-confirmation.
Fantastic, fantastic. So really, in a sense, you want to take us and lift us out of this sort of debate that some might deem to be a little bit myopic and go, really, we should be looking at decision-making more broadly. Okay. Well, here's the first question for the panel. I want to come to you then first, David, on the basis of that. What I'm fascinated, we say that, well, mistakes are inevitable, and I haven't heard anyone here on the panel would disagree with that proposition. But what I'm fascinated about is really the management practices when an error is made in the workplace. And we seem to see two extremes. On the one hand, we want to make this as a personal example. This is really someone who's failed. They've broken a set of rules, so there should be some form of accountability exercised here. Through the other extreme, which will be, well, really, mistakes are inevitable, and that's part of a system. And so really, we should not blame the individual. We shouldn't pathologise this. We should look at the system and see where the system has failed the person. How do you explain such divergent views? And how do you unpack that, David? Especially given your role, you sit over a very complex organisation. I mean, how would you unpack that?
Is that a 1 minute answer? Look, that's
No,
a really...
by the way, we're now off
that's
to
a-
1 minute. So,
yeah.
so I actually want to let you unfold this. And then I'm going to actually throw to other members on the panel to build on this answer. When you build on the answer panel, you might fundamentally say, no, I just disagree with David. I don't know where he's going. But when you say that, I'm looking for your argument behind that. So away you go, David.
So look, I'll probably answer that question and not answer it at the same time. So I think the question's got two parts is, what did we do to facilitate that error occurring? What did we as an organisation do to facilitate that error? And there's a range of things that I could like to talk about, how even we as safety practitioners facilitate people to make errors and have them actually think that the error might be a good idea. And then at the other end is when an outcome or a decision or an action or a behaviour or an error in the workplace has occurred, how others form views about the individual's accountability for that error. And then we get into a world of society and politics and organisations which don't necessarily help the individual involved or even help the organisation to learn from it. Very, very hard thing in modern organisations and institutions to actually have that as a very open discussion. So yes, we have an organisation have a set of life-saving rules, and if you are deemed to have breached life-saving rules in Origin Energy, there will be a range of employment consequences as a result. We'd like to think we do that in a fair and just way, but it would be in what we would understand as professionals as a fair and just way. It would be nothing along the lines of what Sydney might talk about in terms of restorative justice. So we're still struggling with that question, and I think we're somewhere in the middle doing some very traditional things in hopefully some slightly more open and transparent and better ways, but nowhere near the spectrum of ideas about what it could look like.
Okay, so in a sense we're sort of caught within this world of politics and maybe within the own workplace health and safety management system we've actually contributed to, that we are in part the architects. I can see, Michael, you've got a look on your face of concern here.
My concern is not that I disagree. My concern is that we seem to be focused on the wrong question. The reality is I haven't encountered a single person who gets up in the morning who goes into work and says, I want to hurt myself. Yet we spend so much time talking about why did that person did the wrong thing? Why did they not follow the rules? The better question is to understand what were the circumstances that made whatever they did seem like a good idea at the time. So rather than spend all our time trying to blame or no blame, which are the two extremes, and frankly that often gets done in the name of law and legal obligations and legal liability, which is absolute bollocks, we are much better off actually trying to understand why in those circumstances what they were doing seemed to them to be a good idea. In a sense, I'm not as fascinated by the just culture debate and you know, whether it is completely no blame or whether it is, you know, we have to hold people accountable and, you know, make an example of them. I'm not that fascinated by that debate at all because, in a sense, it's an organisation that is really focused on all the wrong things when it puts its energies in that discussion. Ultimately, you have to understand how those circumstances seem to that individual to be a good idea at that point in time in order to stand a chance to make it not seem like the right decision at that point in time without judging them for what they did or didn't do.
Yeah, so you want to put this back into the context of the proximal factors. So really, what did the person know at the time? And you're starting with a moral contract, which is each of us come to work. It seems to build on what Rose is saying. Each of us comes to work with a notion of not harming ourselves or other people. And to focus on that really is a pointless exercise. I could see you, Jeffrey, for a moment there. You had your hands, and I gather you were in deep thought. Can I ask you to unpack what that deep thought was about?
Yeah, so I get troubled with questions like this, and you've tried to reframe the question, but let me tell you what I know about questions like this. This is the sort of question, it's an either-or type thing, it seems to me. It's like you're saying to us, would you rather eat a raw onion or shirt-front Vladimir Putin? Thank God we've gotten over that phase and era. Let me tell you what I know about either-or questions. And it's the story of two sisters and an orange. Do you know that story?
I think I'm going to find out.
So there's two sisters and there's one orange left in the fruit bowl. And as sisters do, they fight over the last orange. So their parents intervene. So what do parents do in such circumstances? They do the obvious. They cut the orange in half. But later it turns out that one sister wanted the pulp to have some orange juice, and the other sister wanted the peel to bake an orange cake. So my answer to questions like this is always the same. Where's the third answer?
That's what we're searching for. So let me ask you, because in a sense, the question I pose is really the one that I hear being posed all the time in the workplace. It tends to be posed, I agree, Jeffrey, as a polemic.
Yep.
It's bimodal. It's either this or it's that. Yet that seems to drive a lot of what we do in our systems. And fundamentally you're caught within there, and people, David, will try and, in a sense, and I'm not being critical, but will patch it up with a just and fair sort of rationale and say, well, this is how we manage that sort of polemic. We put a just and fair in the middle of it, and that somehow will right it. But then we have to ask ourselves, really, does that meet the obligations of what people want? And I'm wondering for you, Sydney, because in a sense, you've written about the different notions of justice. Where does that take you as you think about this question?
Well, I'm glad the question is in fact sliding over to that, and I'm not even meaning that facetiously, Mark, so thanks. I'm understanding orders from, or stringent counsel from my good friend and colleague Eric Holnagel to finally stop talking about human error and stop writing about it and stop using the word as titles to my books. And so the arguments against the use of human error are in fact well explicated in many of my books, so I won't rehearse them here. I think when we move to notions of justice, let me just say this based again on what we heard today, which is I think Pope's remark is a cop-out to say that we are good at screwing up, but we then apparently have to rely on the divine to forgive. Mm-hmm. That's a cop-out. Mm-hmm. I think it is human to err, but it should be human to forgive. Mm-hmm. And I see an increasing troubled picture when it comes to, and I agree with Michael on this, with retributive just culture ideas spreading in organizations, asking who screwed up, who broke the rule, how bad is it, what are the consequences for this person. I would like to go back to Rosa's talk this morning and yesterday and propose, in fact, consistent with the literature, that forgiving is relational. It's about human relationships. It's the apology, it's the repentance, it is the reassurance, it is the disclosure. All of those things are about a relationship and the trust embedded in that relationship. I think we screw that up royally by applying just culture decision trees or other punitive responses to these sorts of things. So there's a lot of distance that we have to cover.
Yes.
And to forgive should be human.
Refreshing. Rosie, I'm wondering if you want to make a comment about that, seeing you've been referenced in terms of this notion of a forgiveness that is much more relational.
Well, yes, and I mentioned in my opening statement that it starts with self-forgiveness. That when we're not comfortable with our own mistakes, acknowledging our mistakes, and the apology is absolutely critical. I've seen an apology turn around an entire organization that was in a lot of pain and a lot of conflict because a manager, leader was willing to say, I messed up or I made a mistake and I need to change my course. The other thing I wanted to refer to was, it does seem like an either-or question, but that's cultural. That's cultural. We want to remove all of the uncertainty and all of the ambiguity. We want to say, this is how we're going to treat these kinds of actions every time. Because can you imagine what kind of chaos would ensue if we treated people as individuals? The whole thing would fall apart.
So in a sense, this sort of polemic actually serves as a purpose. Albeit, I'm hearing from the panel, not overly helpful, but in a sense it creates out of the uncertainty some, at least, form of certainty. Okay, well I want to just ask you then, because often what happens when we think about this is we then move to, well, okay, we accept that human error is a given, and we've heard about the fact that we need to think about justice in a different way, which is more relational. It might start with our own sense of acknowledging who we are and our frailties. But what I'm interested in is when I read a lot of the things in regard to a systems approach, there's another sort of emphasis that somehow we can engineer things out. Somehow, within this system design concept, we can reduce human error, and some would be so bold to say we can engineer it, we can eliminate it. I'm wondering whether the panel has a comment on that. I'm looking to you, Michael. Do you have a comment, as one who's spent many years of your career professionally working in risk management, wrestling with that notion of how one might limit things, if we can at least start with the premise that we forgive people and it's okay to make a mistake, but now we're going to go and look at the system and try somehow to change it. What's your thoughts about, through a system approach then, if we shift away slightly from the individual for a moment?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I can certainly acknowledge that that's certainly the desire of engineers, right? That's the knee-jerk reaction of an engineer, is they can control the human error by putting them in a smaller box and automating more and more and more, and tying their, duct taping. We joke about duct taping the astronauts' hands to the armrests, and then launching the rocket, and they won't screw up anything.
Don't touch.
Don't touch it.
It could be catastrophic.
Yeah, it has.
You get on Qantas Airline, do they let you touch the buttons? No, you can play with your television, and that's about it.
That's about it.
Or we joke about the little Fisher-Price toys, where you give them the indication that what they're doing and turning is doing something, but really has no effect on the control of the vehicle. So.
You're shattering all my illusions, Michael.
Still pays well.
But back to the point.
But back to the point. Yes, it's another maybe fool's errand, but we do try. Engineers do try to do that, and at our side we have humans on both sides, right? So we have the engineers on the ground making mistakes when they design the systems, and the astronauts, at the controls making mistakes on both ends. So the astronauts, of course, don't have an inherent distrust of the engineers of they're going to kill us. They think they're so smart. We need to be able to have manual override in every case. Like Luke Skywalker, of course. How did he blow up the Death Star? Right? He took off the computer and used the force, closed his eyes, and it worked perfect. So there's
well trained.
He's well trained. So that
well, it's certainly an advancement on Homer.
Yeah.
I can say that.
So that's how the astronauts' mentality is they're going to put us in this bind, and they're not going to foresee this. Engineers cannot foresee every possible risk scenario and path that unfolds. We always we always say that spacecrafts fail when they want to and how they want to, regardless of all the failure modes analysis you've done and the hazard analysis. They'll do what they want to do, and they'll fail when they want to. So the astronauts do like to have this flex. They put a lot of comfort, for lack of a better word, in the fact that they'll have full manual control. So there's an astronaut, famous astronaut who walked on the moon, and John Young, he was instrumental in the 70s, making sure every circuit breaker was put into the cockpit, just like an airplane, and everything had manual control. And he fought tooth and nail for about a decade to do that. And ironically, at the end of the day, I'm not sure it made it safer. It probably made it a lot more dangerous for death, but it certainly saved a lot of missions. And that's what I've even shown that quantitatively, is that you putting all this manual override will inevitably will introduce more risk, but this much more risk to losing the crew and killing yourselves. But you're decreasing the risk by this much for losing the mission. So you do use these things because, in retrospect, because things do happen in all sorts of crazy scenarios that you can't foresee, and you're like, oh gosh, we saved the thing. And you see this in the space probes too. You know, they load a whole set of software into the brains of these, you know, Pioneer probes and the Mars probes when things, you know, go wrong. So it is great to have flexibility. But, so I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Well, I'm with all these buttons now, but I'm wondering to open it up to others about this notion, because if we do go down the systems line, it does in a sense apply that we can somehow engineer, and I'm looking to you, Michael, down the end about this sort of notion of reasonably practicable, and you know, we can design things. What's your thoughts about that?
Two thoughts. I mean, firstly, I was quite impressed that Michael introduced into the discussion the fact that human error is not simply limited to the operator, because quite often we talk about human factors as if it's only the worker at the coalface that has the capacity to make the error, but rather it could be the person who's designed the whole system, the engineer, and the leaders in the organisation who are actually making the errors in putting the levers and creating the incentive and disincentives in the system. So there is room for error along the whole system. The second point is that undoubtedly there is room for us to adopt the hierarchy of controls. That's actually the law. That's what you're required to do when you're going down a reasonable practicability analysis. And there is good reason for that, because we know that if we're relying on people at the coalface to protect themselves, they have very limited capacity for doing that effectively, and you're most vulnerable at those stages. So PPE, you can't put people in armours, or sufficiently in armours for them to make sure that they're not going to be injured. We live as a profession in the administrative controls space, and we pretend that they're fantastic, so they're systems, but everything we end up doing is about a new procedure, an administrative control, training, instruction, supervision. Don't get me started about the regulators who enforce the law, who haven't looked beyond administrative controls. It's the only thing they go around doing. Every prosecution that's ever been brought focuses on administrative controls. Your system was defective, your system of work was defective, your instructions were defective, and your supervision was defective, and you didn't do a risk assessment, and I can predict the next prosecution just like that, because that's the pro forma of the regulators. No one actually looks beyond that, looks at engineering controls, at isolation, at substitution. And we understand that hierarchy to be the way in which we ought to be doing things.
You want to turn things in a sense upside down, and we should start from that point. So we're going to talk about engineering things. Let's start at the top, not the bottom.
Well, let's do that even more radically.
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to impugn Michael's enthusiasm for that point, because it is important, but if the hierarchy of controls had been applied really well in that lab in, I think it's St. Mary Street down in London, we would never have penicillin today, right? Error has enormous evolutionary consequences, and good ones for us. We discover, we learn, right? We get stuff we otherwise wouldn't have, so.
Yeah.
Right.
So does that lead us then, Sydney, to understanding something then about performance variability? Is there some relationship to that, and becoming actually, by allowing people to experiment, to innovate, they actually learn? Is that what you're driving at?
Oh, that's Eric Hohenheil's point, obviously, but that's something we all subscribe to, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Rosa, I'm just wondering from a relationships perspective, and not that I'm pigeonholing you there, I'm just interested how you look at this system, and people are within a system, and there's sometimes grand claim that we can engineer things out. That, you know, it's just really a matter of applying more of a greater rigour around the controls and all the stakeholders, and there you go, we've we have eliminated, some would claim, this propensity for error. You want to make a comment on that?
Well, of course, being trained in organizational development, I was trained in systems thinking, and, you know, the idea that you could create a structure as a manager, you could create a structure that would ultimately control human behavior was great. You know, I thought, oh, good, I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to help these organizations put in the right reward systems. We're going to put the right meetings together. But of course, that's not the way organizations work. And that's in the research that I began doing in complexity, my eyes were really opened, because the reality of an organization is that so many unpredictable events can happen from the interactions between people that there is no way to create a system to control that. And especially since, as managers, we're trained that, we're up here, the system's there, we're fixing the system, we're setting the system up, when actually we are part of the system. And we're not trained to look at our own behavior, the way we impact people, the way we treat people. Those things are not part of our training, and that's really what's creating the consequences that ultimately the good ones and the bad ones.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We actually somehow think that we can move people out of the system in a complexity, and yet the research tells us that there's a whole bunch of things that leaders do around commitment and social justice and empowerment that are all part and intertwined with that system. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question in a moment, but I'm just aware that there are people here who have probably got some questions, and it'd be unfair not to throw those questions and throw the panel to the lions. But just so you know where I'm going to come with the last question, because I take your point, Jeffrey, that in a sense to just stay at the polemic of the either or is not helpful. And I would like both my orange juice and the orange rind, because I really like that orange tea cake. So, but yet at the same time, we tend to put human and error together when we talk about safety. So I want to ask you at the end, I'm giving you a bit of warning time, panel, what would be the new third way? If we're going to, in a sense, and you're going to stop writing about human error and follow Eric's advice.
I will.
You will. That's good. Is there a new third way? So I want to give you a bit of thinking time, a little bit of thinking music in the background, because I take your challenge on that, Jeffrey. So over to our audience here in our panel. If you want to come up and grab a microphone, and Kelvin's first, because I know he's been busting with a question. I've seen him out of my left vision. So over to you, Kelvin.
Thanks, Mark. Kelvin Genn. I was interested in the recoil about the discussion around error that happened just at the start of the panel. And I'm interested in error from a different perspective, and I think, Sydney, you started to touch on it with penicillin. And I sort of view error, the problem we've got with error is we recoil from it rather than embrace and welcome error as being how we learn and improve. And I think that's the problem that we've really got now in business and industry and regulation, is the recoil from error rather than the embrace of error. And I always go back to the Google model of make mistakes well, in terms of, that philosophy. We love to try things and fail, because in failure we actually learn and improve. So I just cast that question to the panel: is this the problem? Is the fact that we're looking at error the wrong way, and maybe should we be embracing error in our thinking rather than recoiling from error?
We clearly seem to do this even as parents. There's a lot of overparenting and comment about overparenting and helicopter parenting in this country and others, where we want to prevent our children from making errors and making mistakes and suffering from mistakes. And some of the psychological research around that obviously says that we're not creating very resilient children as a result. Right? So there are immense risks to overparenting, both in families and organizations, and we do a lot of it. Good point.
Jeffrey.
So this is the epicenter of where I get, and I take Sydney's point, that's absolutely right. This is the epicenter of where I get worried. It is counterintuitive that we blame individuals. It's counterintuitive that we blame individuals, because what will happen when we do that is that they'll run down rabbit burrows. And they won't come and play with us anymore. Yeah. In my area, in healthcare, it's crazy to blame individual doctors, because they can take their bat and ball and go somewhere else. Yes. And we don't have a health system. Yeah. So it's also counterintuitive that we would jail a proportion of society, because all we're doing is breeding the next generation of criminals. But we do this. Society does it, even after we've read Sydney's books, and we say, yay, yes. He's right.
Yes.
So what's hardwired into us that makes us do things that are counterintuitive and not in our best interests. Now that's really interesting. Why the hell do we do that? Are we lemmings? So that's where I get worried.
Yeah, and talking of the counterintuitive, there's a lot that gets done that actually drives the opposite intent. And that's what I have a problem. I've got to keep my opinions to the side because I'm here as the facilitator of this debate and I'll work hard at that. But we have another question.
Doing well.
Thank you. No, otherwise if I go, I'll overtread the mark and
We love your
I'll make a mistake and that would be terrible. So over to yourself.
Yeah, Jeff Hurst, I'm on this theme, and I actually thought you must have read the question I had put onto the blog, whatever it is, because you were actually on that topic before about how people make mistakes, and that we've made some comments from Mike about what we can do by way of humans to reduce error and create an environment where we're less likely to make mistakes. But on this topic right now, people are risk takers. Life's exciting if you take risks. Otherwise, we'd still be in bed at home from this morning. So I'm more interested in this bad decision-making stuff. And what can be done, and we've got a lot of things that can be done, but I'd like to hear what the panel's got to say. What can be done to reduce the chances of people making bad decisions in workplaces, which is different to making errors? And I'm with Kelvin here too, and on this mistake stuff is that make mistakes early and often, rather than late and too late.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back because I think this whole area of decision-making, thank you for the question, this whole area of decision-making and what might be deemed to be bad or poor decision-making is a fascinating topic. And David, you actually started us to think about that. Would you like to grab the microphone?
I'd love to. Yes.
Oh, I can see you itching.
That is a fantastic,
Jump in.
That is a fantastic question, and this is probably what's fascinated me most in the last 12 months and definitely has changed most in my thinking over the last couple of years. And try and do it quite quickly, but I'll give you enough leads to go and investigate it for yourself. But as individuals, how do we make decisions as groups of people? So what's our individual and group processes at play, and more from the field of cognitive psychology. And there's a lot in the last 5 years that we've learnt about our biases and heuristics and the framing of decisions and why we would make certain decisions. We heard labels, counterintuitive, bad decisions. They're not for the individual making them or the group making them bad decisions or counterintuitive. And I'd encourage you to look into selection bias, desirability bias, work on rational choice and the framing of decisions within group agreement and social practices that take place. And as I think about everything that I've held true in the last 15 years about do a job safety analysis, get the group involved in the work to do that safety analysis and sign on to it, everything in individual and group cognitive psychology and decision-making actually tells me or leads me to conclude that that is a very ineffective process for actually getting good decisions to be made. And in fact, what we know about biases and within group agreement is we may actually be providing the process that facilitates a group to actually have confidence that the error that they're about to make is actually a good and safe choice. Because if before they even start any of those processes, if they think something is safe, they will select information that confirms that what they think is true. They will then choose desirable outcomes like keeping themselves safe over undesirable outcomes. They will have overconfidence in their own ability to do something. If you put a group together, they'll all confirm that yes, that is actually the case with us and what we plan to do is in fact safe. And then the safety manager's given them a process and a tool and probably some reds and greens and yellows, and they've gone and walked forward into that decision.
He's got to stop talking.
I told you it wasn't a short answer,
But this is simply reinventing the whole human error debate, and it's getting us nowhere, right? For two reasons. One is we know about so many decision biases because you get a PhD in psychology for inventing one, right? And so there is no single other incentive that drives that research as much as that, right? So, and they're all made up, right? They're all figments of our imagination.
I'm shattered, Sydney.
The issue, though, is believe what you want, seriously.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the guy who made this his living, Gary Klein, right? Nobody else has studied decision-making in work and in practice as much as Gary Klein. Gary's first interview is with a fireground commander, right? And he says, tell me about, so Gary's telling me this, right? So Gary says, tell me about the decisions you make at work. The fireground commander looks at him for a while and then answers, I don't make decisions. I put out fires, right? And so as soon as we start, and Jeff, back to you, retrospectively introducing decision moments, bifurcations in the
Yes.
road to perjury, right? We ourselves are being judgmental, and it's so easy to fall into the same trap as saying it's human error all over again, yet by a slightly more legitimate
So
label.
we're just reinventing it.
Absolutely. It's stupid,
Okay.
it's useless, it gets us nowhere.
Well,
So
I'm
let's
gonna
do another
throw-
question.
I'm going to throw to the last question only because of time, and I know that any good panel without a drink it will be a dry argument. So I'm going to throw to maybe one or two more questions from the floor, and then I'm going to ask you, because you've had some time to prepare for this, what is this sort of safety different way? And so we don't fall back into the same old bog, trap, mud, and sink to the thighs with a new version of human error. So I want you to be prepared, because they're really eager to know what you're going to think about this. So over to you. Sorry. Take the microphone.
Sorry, I thought you were asking a question. Hi. Mike Hurd of Engineering Systems Management in Adelaide. I'd like to pick up on something, Michael, that you mentioned about systems approach. Engineers cannot foresee all failures, and about the legal profession focusing, I think you said, on PPE, like the lowest order of control. And people not looking at engineering controls, and yet the WHS, the harmonised legislation, talks about duties of designers, defines a designer as anyone, I think I'm right in saying this, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who makes a decision that affects the design is taking on the duties of designers, and designers have the duties to make things safe so far as is reasonably practicable and apply the hierarchy of controls. Given that that is in the legislation, is it that there's a disconnect between the legislation and prosecutions, or is it that it's just not been tested yet?
Great question.
There is
Yeah.
a perfect storm in the way we investigate incidents and the way that we enforce the law. What management want after an incident is a quick solution. They also want a quick, cheap solution. So the easiest thing to do after an incident is to identify the so-called root cause or root causes, and preferably come up with a corrective action that says we should blame, retrain, and write a new procedure. Blame, retrain, write a new procedure is very cost effective, at least in this year's balance sheet. It also appeases the regulators, and I hope there are regulators in the room. I hope Jennifer's still here. I hope they hear me say this, because they're appalling at this. They don't want to hear you say there needs to be a new design. They don't want to hear you say there is a new technological solution that should have been introduced or should be introduced. They want you to say there was a procedure we should have had that we now have, problem fixed. Now, the reason they want that is because they can just take that to the bank and then bring a prosecution that says exactly that. And whether you give them that answer or you're smart enough to mask that in your report or get some help and don't give them that answer, they're going to go investigate the incident with that preconception in mind. What they want is the person wasn't properly trained. They will go to the person and say, did you really understand what but you have all these documents that say you're trained. I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand it. And they will say, well, what should have happened is there should have been a procedure that dealt with that. I have a client that has, that at the moment, and this continues to be true, has a reversing vehicle procedure. The reason they have a reversing vehicle procedure is because they killed someone reversing the vehicle. So they developed a reversing vehicle procedure. They don't have a driving forward procedure because they haven't killed someone driving forward. But I'm sure one day if they drive the car forward and kill someone, they will have a driving forward procedure. And guess what? They were prosecuted after that incident by the regulator on the basis that, yes, you should have had a reversing vehicle procedure. It's absolute and utter nonsense, but it's convenient for everyone. The companies do it because they know it's the quickest way to get a small fund and get on with life. They don't have to do major surgery to their system and spend lots of money on technological change and engineering controls. The regulators do it because it's a quick, cheap way to get a quick prosecution. They don't want to read other sections in the Act. It requires work and research and actual, effort on their part. That's too hard. The quick solution is the way to go. Now, I should correct, talking about human error, I should correct a previous speaker on a previous panel. It is not true that there are no prosecutions under the health and safety legislation. That is just not right. But I don't think there is the volume of prosecutions in the higher order duties that you would expect to see. Mm-hmm. There certainly are personal prosecutions, but they tend to be the quick and easy prosecutions that the regulators know they can secure. And in fact, one way, people are now working out that one way to convince a regulator not to prosecute you is to give them a nice, fight the first time they prosecute you. They tend not to prosecute you going forward and go pick on someone else their own size. And that's the reality. So if we're waiting for the law to fix our problems, we'll be waiting a long time.
So we probably need fewer lawyers.
Sorry?
We probably need fewer lawyers.
Michael Tuma, he's on our side.
Yeah, sure. So I've got to go and catch a flight, so sorry I have to leave. So I'm going to answer my bit.
Please.
It's a dangerous thing to do.
So my sense, reading people like Sydney and Holnagel and contributing to literature on harm and safety, is we have to learn to be highly tuned to things going right. And I know that sounds trivial, but we're not, because we're highly tuned to find harm and errors and try and find and fix them.
Yeah. And it's
we're highly tuned to that.
Yeah, and that's why I thought, Michael, in all seriousness, even though we wanted applause, it was genuine applause, because I think you've just unpacked a new form of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense,
Ooh.
because I just wanted to get that in for Sydney, just in case you thought it was dead, okay? But to unpack that, to focus on the positive.
We're going to have to learn to do that. And most things go well. And we're going to have to not just celebrate success, that's fine, but we're going to have to understand how come things go well in complex systems. Because we don't really know that.
Yes.
We don't really understand that. So that would be my plea. I'm going to catch a plane. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Put your hands together for Jeffrey. Thank you. And we'll quickly go down the panel and get their last word of wisdom as to what is this way. So we've got one bold idea, and that bold idea is to focus on success. Let's move down. So can I start with you, if that's okay, Rosa?
Well, would you rephrase the question,
Oh,
please?
okay. So what I originally phrased the question, often what we say is safety is all about somehow we put human and error together. So if we're going to avoid this sort of polemic debate, what's the third way forward? Is there another safety differently way we could consider this? And I appreciate in the asking that there's no one right answer, but it'd be good just to get the diversity of answer.
Well, I haven't thought about it that way, but I think the learning organization is certainly a third point.
A third point?
Yes, because you can, when people make mistakes, you learn from it. When people do things correctly, you learn from that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Rosa, that doesn't work, though. we're still in the debate mode, right? No.
No.
Well, we are now.
What doesn't work?
But Michael Tuma's point shows to me that we are really good at learning the wrong... Do I have to shut up? I will. But we're really good at learning the wrong thing, right? Yes. And so this organization is caught in this cycle of stability, having learned the wrong thing and being really good at it.
But I thought we were talking about ideal. Ideal next steps.
Yes. So what we're going to do is ideal next steps, and I'm being given a very helpful. I'll get some applause in a moment if I don't finish up shortly. So, and I don't want this conversation.
It's all my fault.
No, I'm actually thoroughly embedded in this, so I wanted to hear more. But let's go through, Michael.
Well, I'll be brief. I agree with Jeff in the sense that we're a miserable bunch of safety professionals. We just go around and what we say to people is, the sky's going to fall in, the sky's going to fall in. We even have a name for it. It's called mindful leadership. You're supposed to be a mindful leader by waiting around and thinking that the sky's going to fall in the next day. Can we lighten up a little bit and actually celebrate the good stuff that people are doing? Because we know that unless you do that, people are going to be motivated by positive reinforcement. They're not going to be motivated by as effectively by negative reinforcement.
Yeah. So,
and they're going to tune you out.
Yeah. And if they tune out, and then we say people are the solution, they go, hang on, no, you just give me a whole rhetoric that says I'm a problem. Michael.
Wow, my head's spinning. I can't disagree with too much here. I think we're agreeing. Well, maybe we're agreeing. The context is everything, right? And and it's a systems problem. You have to look at the whole thing. So I'm not sure if that's a third way, then maybe that's a third way. That's the only thing I'm agreeing on. The only thing I was going to steal a line from Jeff when he started out, interrupted you and said, "What a bunch of rubbish." But no, what I was going to mention about the rubbish was there's a difference between helicopter parenting. I'm a parent of 3 and letting your kids make mistakes and learn, which is the best way they can learn. Parents need to let their kids fail. But it's different if you're a 747 pilot and you just killed 360 people in the back of the plane and there's consequence, or you're a shuttle pilot and you just, but we had a shuttle pilot actually come in too slow because he was so worried about setting the wheels down just at the right speed. And he actually exceeded the stall speed, so the shuttle should have fell out of the air. He would have killed himself and 6 other astronauts. So there's different consequences. So in my, I guess I'm the least academic here, but in my business, we have to figure out, we're stuck with not so much debating on decision-making and human error, but we have to figure out how to keep these bad, terrible consequences from happening. And like this morning, I set the example of this guy who just, for some reason, 10 seconds early decides to unlock these feathering wing systems and ends up killing himself. So we're stuck with sort of trying to figure out how to mitigate these. But so I know there's context, and that's the context.
Well,
one of the contexts I'm talking about is consequences are very different.
Yeah. I think the context is everything, and in many workplaces it's not play school. You get it wrong, you're paying for keeps, and it's fatality.
Yeah.
So there is. Yeah. So and I think that's a helpful point to bring. Sydney and then David.
So I know that role well, Michael, with 189 people on my tail who go where I point the nose of the airplane. The privilege of a pilot is you're always the first on the scene of the accident. And so that does, in fact, tend to focus the mind a little bit. But my prescription would be get my latest book by the title, Safety Differently. I have a family to feed. It'd be nice. Thank you.
Unashamedly, I tell you.
Well, it's one a year. I mean, you got to keep up.
Okay. David, I want to ask you, because I think, in a sense, you work in an industry that is highly regulated, and it goes to Michael's point of being incredibly dangerous in many respects. So what's your sort of third point where we need to head?
Look, I think it's not a new point today, but it's a point made earlier when Drew Ray spoke about storytelling. I think as safety practitioners, I think what I leave is how are you amplifying the voices and messages around safety within your organisation, and how are you connecting parts of your system and parts of your organisation that need to be on the same page and have the same understanding about safety success and safety concerns. So amplifying those voices, I think, the single most effective thing we can do as safety people.